This is AWANI Global with me, Nailah Huda. And this week on AWANI Global, we take a close look at the Board of Peace, part of the US President Donald Trump's peace plan for Gaza. The group of countries participating in this Board of Peace met for the first time on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum in Davos. The board currently comprises 19 countries, including Indonesia, whereas some major powers in the West have held off from showing support for the board, including the UK, France and Norway. In this episode, we want to look specifically at Indonesia's participation in the board, which has since sparked controversy and criticism at home. So joining us now to tell us a little bit more about that, we have joining us from Jakarta, Pieter Pandie, researcher at the Department of International Relations at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Indonesia. Thank you so much, Pieter, for joining us.
Likewise, thank you.
So maybe we can start off with some of your overall thoughts on what's been proposed by Trump, this Board of Peace for Gaza. How do you think this mechanism might actually deliver peace, especially given that it actually excludes Palestinians from being a part of this, whereas Israel is participating as an equal member? How do you see this as a maybe a peace mechanism, or is it more of a conflict resolution of sorts?
What I can say outside of what you've already outlined in regards to the lack of Palestinian involvement as a member of the Board of Peace itself, on the executive board or on the Gaza executive board itself, I think what it is, especially in comparison to the United Nations Security Council, is a very personalized sort of version of an international institution. If we take a peek at the drafts of the charter that have been circulated online, the powers that are held by the chairman, in this case it's Donald Trump, is very, very strong. The chairman has final say in the implementation, application of the charter itself. The chairman can also only be replaced by voluntary resignation or by unanimous vote by the executive board of the Board of Peace, who are coincidentally also mostly Americans coming from the Trump administration. So the way that the institution is designed is fundamentally different to how, let's say, the United Nations Security Council is designed, where veto powers are spread out across just 5 countries, which is also a point of criticism for many countries, 5 veto-wielding states who kind of serve as check and balances in a way that many would consider inefficient as well. But in the case of the Board of Peace, it's much more centralized. In this case, not even a country, but on a single individual, which is Donald Trump itself.
Before we look specifically at Indonesia, what do you make of some of the countries that have either supported or maybe rejected or refrained from showing support for the board? We're seeing countries in the Gulf like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Jordan participating in the board, while, like I mentioned, some of the other major powers, not just the UK, but China, France, being absent from the signing ceremony. What does this say about the kind of support that it's getting?
So I think many of the sort of bigger powers, or even the US traditional allies, such as the UK, France, even Australia and Japan, have taken a more cautious approach to the Board of Peace. Some have rejected outright, such as France and the UK. Some have accepted, like Canada, but then had their invitation rescinded. And some who have been invited have not given a response as of yet. And those include countries such as China, even US allies such as Australia and Japan. And what that tells me is that the US allies who have rejected show that they are fully on the same page as what the US is trying to do right now as far as global institutions and peacemaking. And others who have not responded are taking a more cautious approach, a more like a wait-and-see approach, also being a little bit wary, I think, of where US foreign policy is being taken under this current administration. As far as countries in the Gulf, it is quite interesting to see that most of the countries in the Middle East and the Gulf have accepted and joined the Board of Peace. And one can speculate as to why there seems to be almost a unanimous decision for those countries to join the Board of Peace. As far as statements go, most of them have paid lip service to wanting peace and stability within the region, which I do think to some extent is the case, but I wonder what other things have pushed them or driven them to join the Board of Peace. May that be economic incentives, trade incentives, or investment incentives that have been offered by the United States outside of the board itself. But these are things that will come out in coming days, I believe, and are a bit difficult to speculate at this point.
As you said earlier, you described this as being sort of different from what we've seen as traditional forms of conflict resolution or peacemaking. Would you say this is still a multilateral framework, or is this a unilateral decision taken by the US, but that's being supported either by choice or as we're seeing some of the threats that's being put out by the US with tariffs and whatnot? Do you think that this is multilateral or otherwise?
Yeah, as I said before, I think the basic nature and design of this institution is fundamentally different from institutions that most countries like Indonesia or others have been accustomed to throughout the history of the liberal international order. Institutions like the United Nations and the bodies that are associated with the United Nations have usually come out of consensus design, consensus decision making, even though some countries may have more political leverage than others, such as, let's say, the veto wielding powers of the United Nations Security Council. What's very different with the Board of Peace is that the charter was by and large designed by, I can assume, the Trump administration itself. Invitations were given out by the Trump administration. Powers of the chairman are overwhelming compared to institutions that we're accustomed to in the liberal international order. So I think it's very, very different to institutions that we've seen in the past. How it will play out in practice, how it will operationalize later once the board starts working, I think will be interesting to see. Whether some countries will just kowtow and go with whatever the chairman of the United States proposes in board meetings, or will there be more political deliberation? I think that remains to be seen. But as far as institutional design based on the charter, I think it's very much centralized towards Donald Trump and the United States.
Now, looking at the signing ceremony in Davos, that came as a surprise to some, especially for Indonesia. What do you think you can describe the sort of narrative that the Indonesian government has been trying to put out, talking about their participation in the Board of Peace and the kind of reaction that we're seeing at home? There's been a lot of criticism as well.
Right. So what's come out of the Indonesian government is that they're justifying Indonesia being participating in this Board of Peace as sort of a continuation of our foreign policy, wanting a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, continuing our fight for Palestinian independence, and so on and so forth, and also being that the Board of Peace is somehow the work of the United Nations Security Council 2803. But there are certain things that are pretty inconsistent, I would say, and I would argue, to Indonesia's traditional foreign policy stances. Number one would be Indonesia has always been pretty critical of how the United Nations Security Council has been designed. We've been critical that it's not representative of developing countries. Power is overwhelmingly centralized towards the five permanent members of, in this case, Russia, China, United Kingdom, France, and the United States. And we've always argued that it's not equitable and there are reforms that are needed to be made as far as making the council more representative and more efficient and more effective in pursuing justice and peace in the international system. By joining this board, I think that betrays a lot of the normative stances that Indonesia has taken in regards to both the Palestinian issue as well as in regards to reform of multilateral institutions. So I think there is a bit of a mismatch as far as what this board and this new institution represents by its design and its nature, and what sort of normative stances Indonesia has argued for in the past through its foreign policy.
What do you think this says about the kind of legacy that the Indonesian administration under President Prabowo is trying to leave on Indonesian foreign policy?
Well, I think what this current administration is trying to do is, from their own words, trying to elevate Indonesia's profile and presence in the sort of international stage. We've seen that over a year of this current Prabowo administration, Indonesia has been very present. The president himself has visited numerous countries, dozens of countries, throughout just over a year of his administration. We've joined not just the Board of Peace, but also organizations such as BRICS. We've bought arms, signed multiple trade deals and arms deals with multiple countries. So I think what this administration is trying to portray is an Indonesia that is active and what I would argue is status seeking or prestige seeking, trying to be present at every table, trying to be the bride at every wedding, in that sense. So I think activism is where the instincts lie at this administration. But what I worry is that activism comes at the cost of norms and principles that Indonesia has held on to very strongly in its foreign policy over the years. And whether our involvement in many of these sort of institutions and forums are strategic or not, and whether they are aligned to our national interests and values or not. So I think activism is okay, but there needs to be considerations outside of that, whether that be normative, strategic, or other.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit also about the response, the public sentiment towards this move. As I said, it I think came off as quite a surprise that it came so soon, the signing ceremony in Davos, and that it happened without any prior public consultation. Has there been any sort of announcement, any hints that were given by the administration before this?
No, I think the decision came quite quickly. Even news that Indonesia was invited came from, I believe, mostly foreign sources. And then the decision that Indonesia would join was made incredibly quickly. I think while Prabowo was making his trip to Davos, or while he was already at Davos. So I think the public knowledge of it was very short term. People didn't know of it long beforehand. The public reaction, I would say, at least on social media, from what I've seen, has been pretty negative. Most people have rejected or very much criticized Indonesia's participation, and also a few foreign policy observers have also written articles, such as myself, on various media platforms to criticize or question the government's decision for Indonesia to join the Board of Peace. But I have also personally seen or heard dissenting opinions arguing that this may be some sort of new solution to the long-standing Israeli-Palestinian issue, and that we should, give it a chance or some sort. But what I would say is that most Indonesians at this point have been critical and questioning the government's decision to do so.
As you said before, this is pretty inconsistent with Indonesia's long-standing foreign policy. What do you think it signals or it says when Indonesia is opting for this sort of mechanism that is outside multilateral or legally binding frameworks? As you said, they've been quite critical of frameworks or bodies like the UN Security Council for being, not so representative of developing countries. But, what do you say? What do you think this says about not just Indonesia, but perhaps developing countries and the sort of faith or trust that they have in multilateral frameworks? There's been a lot of discussion, of course, about this erosion of trust and confidence in multilateralism. Do you think this is one of those signals?
Yeah, I think in regards to your question, I think we're at a very sort of a period with a heightened level of uncertainty, if not at a transitionary point. Everyone has been talking about the Mark Carney speech at Davos, head of state of Canada, saying that there's been a rupture in the international system and we're in a transitionary period towards something new. And I think we're at this sort of point where multilateral institutions, the liberal international order, rules, norms, and institutions are being viewed differently, even by the countries who contributed most greatly to designing it, the United States. We can see them withdrawing from these norms and values and institutions which they helped build and which they've benefited greatly from. So I think it's a very uncertain period where we're seeing great powers such as the United States and others acting in a way that we wouldn't have guessed they would in 20 or 30, 40 years ago, at the height, let's say, of the international liberal order. So I think most countries, developing countries, are also changing their views or trying to figure out what sort of changes are going to come in the next few years.
What's also been reported is that countries participating in the board, or at least trying to gain permanent membership on this board of peace, they have to pay a sort of membership fee of about $1 billion US. And you were, talking a little bit about how or what the Indonesian administration under Prabowo, what they're trying to achieve is this sort of elevated status on the global stage. Do you think that this is the sort of tangible influence that Indonesia can gain from this? Do you think it's compensate for the high fee that they have to fork out for this membership?
Again, I think it is quite questionable whether or not we can gain sort of tangible strategic outcomes out of this Board of Peace. As I said before, I think the institutional design is not one where regular members, such as Indonesia, will likely become, will have significant political or institutional leverage to be able to push for certain initiatives or solutions when veto powers or implementation of the charter powers are overwhelmingly centralized on the chairman himself. So I think by virtue of that on its own, it's difficult to see how the board will actually work in practice when the charter itself is already limiting the influence that member states can have outside of the United States itself. As far as the budget, I think it's a very big amount of money to sort of pay upfront for membership into this board, and one that I think is also a mismatch as far as how this administration under Prabowo has approached the national budget. We know that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has faced significant budget cuts that has affected its operational costs and whatnot. And then we have this sort of a very huge fee for joining the Board of Peace, which I believe is also much bigger than the current budget of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. When you think about it, in foreign policy making and actually doing foreign policy, we need a well-budgeted, well-oiled machine in the foreign ministry so they can actually do their tasks of diplomacy in the multiple international forums that Indonesia is a part of. But what we see in the past year is budget cuts for the foreign ministry, but a very, very high cost one-time payment for joining a board that Indonesia might have lesser political or strategic leverage. So I think there's that sort of mismatch that I question as well, and also many others have questioned in regards to the choices that this administration has made in regards to foreign policy.
If we try to see the positive in all this, if we can even try, do you think there is any effective way for not just Indonesia but for other Palestinian allies that have signed up in the board could potentially try to influence from within this sort of mechanism, or do you think it's entirely impossible when Palestinians are themselves excluded from this?
I'm not sure. Again, it'll really have to depend how the board works in practice. So far, we haven't seen meetings being convened of the board. We've seen the signing ceremony, but nothing after that as of yet. Technically, countries with like-minded interests towards the Middle East and the Palestinian cause may form coalitions within the board to fight back against any sort of solution that may be a hindrance to Palestinian independence and so on. But I do believe we'll have to really see what it'll be like, political deliberations and negotiations within the board. It's really tough to say at this point. I mean, in the past, 1 month of 2026, we've seen a lot of very unpredictable situations occur. In 2 or 3 weeks, we might see Trump getting bored of the board and then, just disbanding it entirely. So I think it really, since power is very, very centralized on Trump himself, it also depends on his own whims as much as the members itself. So it's really a toss-up, I would say.
Yeah, no, that's a very likely outcome. Another sort of point of view to consider is if we were to look at this within the sort of ASEAN framework as well. Looking at the list of countries that have signed up, Indonesia is the sole Southeast Asian country to have shown support for the Board of Peace. Do you think that this could potentially sort of become a thorn in the flesh for ASEAN member states? As we've seen in the past year, there's been sort of divisive issues with the Israel-Palestine crisis. Some being somewhat neutral on the matter, with some like Malaysia being more outspoken on the issue, and with Philippines as chair of ASEAN this year. Do you think that this could become a potential issue for ASEAN member states?
Yeah, I think as you rightly said, there's been different sort of approaches to the Board of Peace, even amongst the ASEAN member states. I believe Singapore was invited but has not responded officially. Malaysia has been critical. Indonesia has joined. I think Vietnam has expressed interest in joining the Board of Peace. So there has been a sort of mixed response as far as individual states within ASEAN and joining the Board of Peace. But I think whether or not this becomes an issue for ASEAN, ASEAN has far bigger issues at hand, I believe, that stretches beyond just the Board of Peace. Whether that's issues within our own region, let's say South China Sea, Myanmar, and so on and so forth. I think there's a lot of homework that needs to be done in our own neighborhood as far as how ASEAN works. How this board will affect ASEAN, I believe, is whether the board will work on conflict areas beyond just Gaza. Let's say that it extends to our region, Southeast Asia, and it starts being involved in issues such as, let's say, Myanmar, South China Sea, or other. I think that's when we can start to see differences in positions start to play out. But until then, I think ASEAN has a lot of issues on its own hand that we probably need to talk about more and get to common positions and solving sometime soon.
Domestically, do you think that this could potentially make a dent in the Prabowo administration? I know national elections are still a long way to go, but do you think this is one of the issues that the Indonesian government should pay more attention to, given the sort of negative criticism and response it's been getting from the public?
I think so. I think we've seen very significant negative public responses, at least on social media. But as of yet, it hasn't really materialized into mass protests or anything of that matter, or mass assembly that we've seen throughout the past year, let's say in August in Jakarta, or the various other protests throughout the country. So I think until then, until protests occur or something of that nature, the government is quite happy just to limit it to negative social media responses. Whether it will lead to that or not, I think we'll have to see. But I think so far the government has already faced high number of dissatisfaction on certain social media platforms more than others. That really hasn't changed how they've done their own policy. So I think social media has shown a high level of dissatisfaction for certain segments or sections of the public, but others maybe not as much. So I think it really depends on how it'll play moving forward.
Thank you so much. That is Pieter Pandie. Thank you so much for sharing with us some of your thoughts on the Indonesian government's narrative on participating in the Board of Peace and what the sentiment has been like back home. Thank you, Pieter.
Thank you.
That is all on AWANI Global. That was Pieter Pandie, researcher at the Department of International Relations at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Indonesia, sharing his thoughts on what the response has been like towards the Board of Peace proposed by the US President Donald Trump as part of his overall peace plan for Gaza, of course sparking controversy and criticism as to whether it can deliver peace for Palestinians or whether it's part of his PR plan, probably in his bid to get the Nobel Peace Prize once again. But that is all on AWANI Global this week. We'll catch you next time as we explore more geopolitical and current global issues and world news weekly. That is all with me on Nailah Huda. Nailah Huda. We'll catch you next time.